Hi, I'm Alessandra Kelley, professional fine artist and tonsure sponsor. Everything humans do is art. Here's a typical mid-19th century Western European lady's outfit, which involves this many layers. Western European women wore massive dresses from the 16th through the 19th centuries, a nearly unbroken line of huge outfits that suddenly stopped being a thing just over a century ago. Men's clothing was also very thick and heavy, and also simplified dramatically about a century ago. Even before fashion history became a respectable academic discipline, people came up with many theories to explain why people had historically worn these bulky, elaborate outfits and why they fell out of fashion. Morality, psychology, neuroses, repression, squeamishness, display, social status, all have been presented as possible explanations for the big clothes Western Europeans have worn in the last 500 years, along with theories of enlightenment, advancement, superior materials, and liberation to explain the lighter weight dress of today. These are mostly plausible arguments. However, in looking at the history of Western European clothing, there is one absolutely vital factor generally ignored: climate, the environment people live in, their context, because there is one good basic reason to wear a lot of clothes. It was cold. The years of big fashion map pretty closely to what's called the Little Ice Age, which hammered the lands bordering the North Atlantic between the 15th and the 19th centuries. It was the coldest Europe had been since the start of the Holocene almost 12,000 years ago, and the climatological phenomenon of the Little Ice Age overlaps the history of European big clothing with remarkable fidelity. Climate is rarely studied as a driver of European fashion. It's a different story for people outside of Europe, say in Mesoamerica or East Asia. So let's see how Western European costume and climate correlate over the centuries. I'm working with a bit of a simplified diagram here. The charts don't always entirely agree because they're from different locations and different seasons, and they can be a little eye-blurring. Some places got a little colder, some places got a lot colder. Nevertheless, the general trend is clear. For at least the 1,000 years before 1100 CE, and possibly for a lot longer, global temperatures had been fairly consistent and predictable. Then, in Europe, there was an anomalous warm period called the medieval warm period, go figure, from about 1100 to 1300 CE. And then, in 1300, temperatures started dropping. By 1400, temperatures had dropped back down to the previous long-term average, but they kept going down, and the Little Ice Age began. For about 500 years, from 1400 to 1900 more or less, temperatures in the land masses around the North Atlantic were, with only brief exceptions, measurably colder than the long-term average, with all the ensuing chaos that a changing climate can have on unprepared people who had expected things to go along more or less as they had been. And then, after 500 years of European-American people living with and basing their expectations on a cold climate, around 1900 CE, global warming began to take hold. So I wanted to look at the last 600-ish years in a more granular fashion to see if and how fashion changes map to the ups and downs of climate change in Europe. Does climate change account for all of the fashion changes during that time? No, of course not. Humans are humans, and everything humans do is art. People are always going to be inventive and interested in change and novelty and movement and beauty and all of those things. But climate is the foundational environmental necessity for wearing clothes. It should never be neglected. The question of climate should always be asked when looking at people's garment choices. So let's back up a bit to see what Western Europeans were wearing before the Little Ice Age. This is what Western Europeans were wearing during the medieval warm period in the centuries before 1300 CE, an era of warm summers, mild winters, and reliable rains. Wine grapes were grown much farther north than they currently are. There was a population boom and expansion during these centuries, as a stable climate could be relied on to produce plenty of crops and fodder for animals. Clothing was playful and colorful, close-fitting and light, longish but not enveloping. Outfits consisted of a simple linen shift shirt or chemise as underwear, and one or two layers over that depending on the season and changing fashions. Clothing was made of linen or wool. Wealthy people wore silks. People in those days did wear fur, but it was almost always squirrel fur, lightweight and silky, and not too warm, in a special pattern called vair, which you can see all over medieval art. This is what it looked like in heraldry, and this is what it looked like in real life. There's a story, and I'll let you know right now that it's a dumb story, that medieval clothing was static, all sort of the same-ish, unchanging over long centuries as culture stagnated, marking time until the magnificent Renaissance comes along. This is a narrative in some of the most seminal fashion histories, and it's complete nonsense. Fashions, then as now, changed all the time. There's not a lot of visual art to give us a precise idea of how much and how fast, but there are at least visible differences between European garments from one century to the next. Around Around the year 1300 CE, the temperature, although still warmer than the long-term average, started a long decline. Cool, wet summers ruined crops and led to famine. The Baltic Sea froze over twice. The Viking colonies in Greenland pivoted from farming to hunting, lost touch with European traders, and eventually vanished. The Black Death hit in mid-century. Population numbers plummeted. Clothing began to get heavier. Quilted padded jupons, buttoned down the front and belted low on the hips, became fashionable for men. Long cotehardies, also buttoned down the front, became fashionable for men and women both. You get the first European mention of velvet, a luxury Chinese fabric long popular in the Middle East. And there was a dramatic shift in which furs people wore. Scholar Elspeth M. Veal studied records of imported furs in England in the 14th century. Early in the century, she found records of plentiful shipments of squirrel furs, good old-fashioned vair, but not much else. By the end of the 14th century, the squirrel was joined by new furs, lambskins and budge, which is a kind of low-grade wool, and thick, warm sables and martens. Beaver is mentioned as a source of felt for hats as early as Chaucer. And this kept trending. People wore less vair, even though the price of squirrel fur was low and getting lower. They were wearing thicker, warmer furs instead. This is what people were wearing just at the end of the 14th century, when temperatures dropped below the long-term average and the Little Ice Age properly started. Long, cold winters were not yet considered normal. December was depicted as a month of bare ground and leaves not yet fallen from autumn-colored trees. The only snow in this 1390s cycle of the months is in February, and it's light enough and novel enough for a playful snowball fight. King Wenceslas, no, not that one's, personal copy of the Bible was chaka with lightly clad bathhouse girls. The 15th century shows a shift to heavier garments, like these early versions of the houppelande, a long, voluminous belted robe with big decorative sleeves. Women wore the houppelande over a close-laced, often short-sleeved dress called a kirtle. Peasant women like these farmers might wear just a kirtle over the chemise in midsummer. Even in warm places like Italy, people were piling on more layers. Men's legwear changed as the climate got drafty. Until now, hose, men's tights, had been two separate garments, like really long socks. But now they were joined to breeches and called breech hose, calzas bragas in Spanish, or they were lengthened, fastened together, and the gap in the middle covered with that new fashion accessory, the codpiece. Women's houppelans morphed into a fur-lined robe with a tight belt, a wide V-neck, and an enormous skirt worn over the kirtle. Very popular in France, Burgundy, and the Netherlands. At the same time, women's hats reached their maximum size. This, from the 1470s, became one of the classic princess looks in modern fairy tales. In 1480, there was a brief pulse upward into slightly warmer temperatures. It seems to have peaked, though still below average, around 1510, so let's take a quick look there. We can see a lightening of garments around 1480 as the V-necked dress gets replaced by a much thinner, closer-fitting square-necked fashion that looks like a development of the kirtle of the older outfit, as though women shucked the outer houppelande and started going around in their underdresses. Big hats fall out of fashion, but the hood that was worn over the front of them remained. This, very suddenly, is the early Tudor look, as popularized on playing cards. After the late 15th century warm pulse, temperatures dropped for almost the whole of the 16th century. Interestingly, this is just about when corsets, or as they were called at the time, stays, became a standard garment for women across Europe. Stays were made with at least 2 layers of strong canvas plus stiffening or boning, and would have provided extra warmth for the core trunk. And I do think it's awfully interesting that the time of women universally wearing corsets overlaps the Little Ice Age so well, including, as we will see, corsets going away just after the Little Ice Age itself ended. There's a really important thing about stays and corsets that doesn't get talked about much. They were load-bearing. Corsets and stays didn't just shape the torso and support the back. They were a sturdy structure to hang heavy skirts off in a way that did not burden the shoulders or the neck. You'll see eyelets and hooks and all sorts of things at the bottom of historical corsets to attach skirts to. Women needed many skirts to combat the cold, and that weight had to be handled somehow. Stays were a multi-purpose solution. Women's dress at this time consisted of multiple layers. First, a linen shift easily washable to protect nice clothes from bodily secretions. Then stays to shape the torso and provide support for all the skirts. Then petticoats to hold out the skirt. Maybe an understructure as well, depending on the shape of the skirt. The skirt and bodice were separate. Sometimes the sleeves were separate as well. There were also multiple kinds of little or big kerchiefs and wraps and scarves and extra bits for extra warmth. Collars and ruffs became separate garments, gloves were generally worn, and hats, caps, and hair decorations are a category all to themselves. And that's the basic layers. Rich ladies wore more layers and fancier trims. Fashion histories tend to explain early 16th century men's massive shoulders and women's enormous skirts as bulk equals importance, as if the dramatic expansion of people's garments were a matter of pure psychology. And probably there is some of that, but the demands of a cooling climate should not be ignored. In the early 16th century, thick furs became popular. Poor people and servants were still wearing unfashionable squirrel, but the gentry and nobility were shown wearing marten and sable, lynx and fox, and more exotic furs. Fabrics were very heavy. The wealthy preferred silk, satins, and brocades and velvets, and the middle and poorer classes wore a lot of woolens. Ladies wore detachable fur sleeves with their dresses. The British had hunted most of their valuable fur animals, such as beavers and wolves, to extinction already, so they imported vast numbers of furs from the Northeast and increasingly the Americas, especially Canada. In the Acts of 1509, King Henry VIII of England tried to bar people below the rank of gentlemen from buying imported furs, which did not stop them or even slow them down. 1534 gives us the first recorded organized social fox hunt in England. Fox fur was highly prized and valuable, and they did make use of the pelts of all those critters. Pest control my foot. In 1535, Henry VIII declared that all men should wear beards. In 1536, the River Thames froze solid enough for Henry VIII to travel to different parts of London by sleigh. Worldwide, glaciers began to expand. While beaver fur felt hats never stopped being fashionable, regular fur fell out of fashion in Western Europe in the later 16th century. It was still worn by servants, and for some coronation and ceremonial purposes, and in Poland and points east, and in winter by old people, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a picture of Queen Elizabeth I of England wearing fur. The William Cigar ermine portrait is about as close as you get, and that's not even a real ermine, that's a heraldic ermine. So what do you do when it's frippin' cold and fur's not the thing? You have different coping mechanisms. Western Europeans piled on the layers. Thick padded breeches, thick padded doublets, thick padded sleeves, thick padded skirts, felt hats, beards, ruffs to keep the wind from your neck. The padding was literally called bombast, in case you were wondering where bombastic comes from. Fur was still important as a material, even if it was unfashionable to wear it directly. Beaver fur felt was still used to make warm, soft, waterproof hats, which were nearly universally worn. By the end of the 16th century, Western European fashions looked like this, even in high summer. And while I'm sure they would be brilliant at a Renaissance Christmas fair, they look like they would be absolutely miserable for the sorts of summertime Renaissance fairs we have around where I live. The 17th century was the worst, and I don't just mean politically. It was the nadir of the Little Ice Age. Temperatures plummeted, crops failed, half a dozen villages near Mont Blanc were flattened by glaciers. People around the Baltic Sea invented the ice boat, which soon became used for cargo transport in the frozen Netherlands. In 1604, a Venetian in London said, "The weather is bitterly cold and everyone is in furs, although we are almost in July." London had its first frost fair in 1608, where a whole festival was set up on the ice of the frozen Thames River. You start to get folk songs like "To Drive the Cold Winter Away." The frigid winter landscape became a new and popular art subject. Even in paintings explicitly set in the summertime, people look bundled up in a way that does not look comfortable to modern eyes. The silhouette softened and ruffs went limp, but people were still covered from chin to toe in multiple layers, plus warm wool or fur felt hats. If you ever wondered why people in history wore hats and caps all the time, it was not just fashion, it was to keep warm. The climate changes exacerbated social ills. The 17th century was overloaded with appalling religious wars and atrocities, not helped by crop failures, famines, and disease caused by the chaotic and unpredictable weather changes. It was wild and it was not good. You'll see a lot of group portraits of city militias at this time. While most of them are not as lively as Rembrandt's famous example, they do tend to be fairly precise records of how middle-class men's fashions changed from a sort of late Renaissance look in the early part of the century to a more musketeerish style in the middle. This is the time of one of my favorite bizarre men's fashions that for some reason isn't popular in historical depictions. Rhinegraves, or petticoat breeches, were swingy, loose, knee-length shorts almost like culottes. They looked like skirts with masses of looped ribbons applied at the waist and in rectangular patches at the sides of the knees. Super popular between 1660 and 1680. Can't imagine why these never show up in pirate romances. By 1680, the North Atlantic region was the coldest it had ever been in all of recorded human history. The winter of 1683 to 84 saw the Great Frost in England. Ice on the Thames was a foot thick in London, where they held another frost fair. The coasts of the North Sea became icebound, locking in harbors in England, France, and the Netherlands, and shutting down trade. Soldiers froze to death at their posts. There was famine in France and Scotland and Norway and Estonia and Livonia and Finland and Sweden. This is what fashions looked like during those years. People of all classes were wearing more wool fabrics. Men were wearing great big woolly wigs that covered their necks and fell over their shoulders like a little warming cape. Hats were made to be carried under the arm since it was impossible to wear them over those huge wigs. Men's coats now had huge skirts which totally hid the breeches. Sleeves were long, cuffs were big, and scarves and cravats had completely replaced ruffs and big collars. Women wore their hair mounded up high with one little curl on each side of the forehead, often topped by a stiffened lace doodad called a fontange. The old Renaissance model of bodice and skirts got replaced by the mantua, a new form of women's dress made from a single length of pleated fabric worn over a petticoat, the ancestor of 18th century dresses. In the 1680s, the coldest deep freeze of the Little Ice Age, women's necklines went higher and covered their shoulders. The standard explanation for this is that it was the conservative influence of King Louis XIV's secret wife, the devoutly Catholic Françoise d'Aubigné, Madame de Maintenon. But honestly, that this happened in the coldest spell of the coldest temperatures in 12,000 years might have had something to do with it. Old-fashioned wear was virtually forgotten. It was so out of fashion that in 1697, when Charles Perrault published his book of fairy tales, he didn't know the word. He mistook ver, squirrel fur, for its homonym, ver, meaning glass, and so changed Cinderella's soft fur slippers to hard glass ones, and a new trope was born. Although overall average temperatures were never again to reach the depths of the late 17th century, there were still some records set. The winter of 1708 to 1709 may have been the coldest individual winter ever recorded across Europe. Drought alternated with torrential rains and flooding became more common. There were more crop failures, food riots, and migrations. In 1712, the first shipment of Javanese coffee reached Amsterdam, and hot drinks for cold weather were forever changed. The winter of 1715 to 16 was particularly severe. London hosted another Thames Frost Fair. When we look at Western European fashions from these years, we see a certain amount of coasting. It's not easy to tell which fashions are from 1680 and which from 1720. This is made harder because there was a contemporary fad for neoclassicism, and in a lot of people's portraits they're just enveloped in mounds of satin that they imagine look like timeless toga drapery or something. The number of portraits of women dressed in fantasy cosplay as Diana is not small. So far as I can see, under all those rumpled satin sheets, men are still wearing big woolly wigs and the same sorts of coats. Women's necklines have shifted lower, but apart from that, they're still painted wearing the same hairstyles, the same bodice decorations, the same everything as from 40 years earlier. It's rare to see fashion stay static for so long, but it happens sometimes. In this case, it may have been the iron grip of Louis XIV, and that he was super old and conservative and didn't want anything to change, so fashion stayed fossilized until after he died in 1715. Temperatures started dropping again and continued dropping over the 18th century. Men's breeches were now cut more closely to the leg, and they were worn tucked into men's socks, which is something I can't unsee now. Women's high hairstyles went out of fashion, and from the 1720s on, most women had their hair dressed neatly and close to their heads. In about 1724, a startling new fashion appeared: tiny wigs. Suddenly, some young men were wearing little close-fitting powdered wigs with little curls at the side, with the back gathered into a bow or bag. Big woolly-wigged old men were scandalized. There was a transitional hairstyle where men and boys wore a tiny wig but had a huge ponytail behind it. You can still see it in court dress later on. The winter of 1728 to 29 was noticeably severe. In Norway, an entire farming community was lost to the Abrekkebreen Glacier. But the thing about weather is it's chaotic. Even when average temperatures are overall rising or dropping, you'll get some anomalies. So the English autumns of 1729 through 1731 were all unusually warm, with heat records that weren't broken until 2006. Men's clothing got tighter while their coat skirts and cuffs got bigger. Women's dresses fluctuated in fashion but stayed many-layered and big. A very mild 1738 to 39 winter was followed by the absolutely brutal winter of 1739 to 40. There were gales and winds, a massive amount of snow, drifting blocks of ice on the Thames crashing into ships. Shipping was disrupted. In London, there was a shortage of food and other supplies for the first 2 months of the year. Even as late as May, peat was frozen too hard to be cut. Farming was difficult that spring, and there was an outbreak of scurvy owing to a lack of fresh vegetables. 1745 is the earliest I found an image of really tight men's breeches buckled at the knee over the stockings. Some men, even fashionable men, were still wearing their breeches old-style tucked into their stockings at least as late as 1752. But by the mid-1750s, it looks like most men had adopted tight breeches, buttoned or buckled at the knee, worn with the stockings tucked into them, the familiar look that we expect to see in the 18th century. The second half of the century seems to have been quite wet, at least in England. There were lots of heavy rains and floods, fog storms, and inundations. Fur trim returned to ladies' dresses about 1750, especially ladies who wanted to emulate what they thought of as Turkish, Polish, or other exotic costume. In the 1760s, men's coat skirts got narrower and closer to the hips. Sleeve cuffs were of more modest size by the 1770s. Women's hair had been dressed small and close to the head since the 1720s. It only began to puff up on top in the 1760s. It did not get Marie Antoinette big, the visual cliché of the 18th century, until the very late 1770s. And that was a super brief fashion, over already by 1780, when fashionable women's hair got brushed out sideways into a rounded cloud. Swimming was discouraged in the 18th century, but there were health spas. Women swam in full-length, long-sleeved, loose linen gowns, weighted down at the hem with leads so they would not float up and expose, I don't know, knees or something. Fur came back into fashion in a big way in the form of big ol' muffs to keep your hands warm, very popular starting in the 1780s. In the summer of 1783, Laki, a volcanic fissure in Iceland, began erupting, continuing for 8 months, devastating Iceland and spewing masses of sulfur aerosols into the atmosphere. That summer in Europe was very hot, hazy, and stormy. The sun was reddish even at noon, and sunrises and sunsets were really spectacular. Benjamin Franklin noted that year that you could not set a piece of paper on fire using magnifying glass in the sun. There were increased reports of respiratory problems, and the death rate spiked among outdoor workers in England and France. The winter of 1783 to 84 was brutally cold, and the spring thaw saw huge floods in Germany and Central Europe. All of these are signs of a volcanic winter. For a few years after this, winters were very cold and summers were cool and very dry. Crops failed from the volcanic winter as late as 1785, and there's a good argument to be made that the subsequent famines contributed to the social disorder that led to the French Revolution in 1789. There was another frost fair on the Thames in 1789. Clothes were big and warm, big and warm, big and warm. Hello, what's this? So, remember that pulse of neoclassicism a century ago when you couldn't see the cut of clothes for the toga party swags of satin? Well, it's back, but different this time. Temperatures got warmer for a short while at the end of the 1790s. At least in Western Europe. And neoclassicism returned with a vengeance in architecture, art, music, and fashions. For women, men mostly swapped over to a myriad of variations on the dark wool three-piece suit. But in the 1790s, women started wearing lightweight dresses that they fancied were cosplay of ancient Greece. Fashionable women also cut their hair short, at least for a time. And for a bit, in England at least, winters were mild and summers were warm, so dressing super light was not as miserable as it could have been. Even stays got short for a little while as they didn't need to hold heavy skirts up. But this state of affairs did not last. Starting in 1808 and going through 1815, there were a number of substantial volcanic eruptions in different places worldwide that had a planetary cooling effect. There was one last frost fair in London in 1814. Structural changes to the bridges made them impossible later on, even when it was cold enough. Heavy rains across Belgium in 1815 may have contributed to Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. And these pseudo-Greek costumes, these thin light dresses with the snazzy new lightweight cottons from India, were not really suited to a northern climate, let alone one deep in the throes of a little ice age. Moralizers sniffed that in mere cotton ladies would die of pneumonia. So it's worth noting that almost the first indispensable accessory for these dresses was the lightweight but warm wool paisley shawl, which, like the marvelously thin cotton fabrics the gowns were made of, were crafted in India. And the second was jackets, either the new short spencer or the new long pelisse, and ladies were still carrying gigantic fur muffs. 1815 saw the last of the great cooling volcanic eruptions. Mount Tambora in Indonesia exploded in the single largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. Volcanic ash and gases blocked sunlight worldwide, leading to more cooling and what was dubbed the year without a summer in 1816. Crops failed, sunsets were super orange, there were famines and food riots. Switzerland was so miserably cold and rainy that Mary Shelley and friends were stuck indoors on their summer vacation, and they wrote horror stories to relieve the boredom. In the next few decades, women's garments would heap on new layers and more bulk. Stays got longer again and more reinforced and were now called corsets. The winter of 1829-30 was severe. Lake Constance on the Rhine, where Germany, Switzerland, and Austria meet, froze over completely for the first time since 1740. There was a spectacular White Christmas in 1830, which is said to have had a profound influence on Charles Dickens's idea of what a Christmas should look like. The 1830s and 40s were cold and wet on the whole. Not only did this lead to crop failures, it facilitated the spread of cold, wet-loving pathogens like the infamous blight which ruined potato crops across Europe. Dresses and sleeves in the 1830s got bigger and bigger, and skirts were short enough to show ankles. Around 1837, the giant sleeves collapsed and the skirts slammed to the floor and stayed there for the rest of the century. The classic Victorian silhouette of tightly restrained torso and gigantic floor-length skirt had arrived. Temperatures held steadily cold for most of the 19th century, which is when a lot of expectations about winter got into pop culture. This is why we get so many Currier and Ives prints that look like this, and this is why we dream of a white Christmas. Railroads began to be built in the 1840s, replacing old canal transport systems. Railroads were faster and less constrained by geography than canals, but just as importantly, they did not freeze to a standstill in the winter. Fashions stayed heavy, bulky, and warm. People of all ages routinely wore long underwear all the time. Hats were commonplace. Gloves were universal. Corsets, now called corsets instead of stays, were reinforced and strengthened with steel to support the weight of all those skirts on the hips. The practical lock-stitch sewing machine was invented around 1845, and it spread to common use by the 1860s. Some dress reformers began to push for simplified, rational dress, but the invention of machines to make sewing easy had a paradoxical effect. Rather than saving time and simplifying things, it led to an explosion of more layers, more detail, more ruffles, more fol-de-rol and fussiness. Women's clothing got really elaborate. Later generations grinned at how covered up the Victorians were, attributing it to neuroses and intolerance. But later generations were already living on a warming planet where showing bare legs did not risk chilblains. Later generations also got weird about corsets. There was some controversy about corsets in the 19th century, not helped by obvious sock puppets of men with fetishes who were writing magazine editorials while pretending to be young ladies in order to promote tight lacing. But mostly corsets were underwear, the bra of the 19th century, support for the back and the boobs, and a convenient anchor for skirts. Practical. For that matter, women did not tight-lace nearly as much as pictures might suggest. It was more common for women to pad their bust and hips so that their waist would look smaller by comparison. Only later did the mere wearing of a corset become associated with sexuality. Skirts got very big by the 1850s, held out by many layers of starched petticoats. The cage crinoline was invented in France in 1856 to reduce the weight. Swimming became more socially accepted, but it must have been cold on the beaches. These layered, full-coverage mid-century ensembles were considered appropriate for strolling at the seashore at the height of summer. They put little children in velvet suits. In August, swimsuits were now complex woolen ensembles, trousers and tops for men, the same for women, plus wool turbans to cover the hair, and stockings and swimming slippers to cover any stray bit of leg, and long wool skirts weighted down with lead whites to avoid any unseemly floating. Invisibly, the Little Ice Age was coming to an end, though people didn't know it. Women's fashions danced around the idea of a bustle for about 20 years, dramatically changing and discarding the fashionable colors, skirt shape, and decorations from one season to the next. The Little Ice Age ended without fanfare. After about 1890, the temperature started its inexorable rise. Within a decade, women's clothing began to get noticeably more lightweight in materials. Heavy silks and stiff woolens have been replaced by lighter, floaty silks, soft cottons, and lace. Over the next 15 years, the silhouette changes, becoming less padded and bulked out. The changes in men's clothing were more subtle, since men had long since been able to put on and shed layers from their suits to suit their own comfort. Their swimwear got visibly smaller. If I've read these charts right, global temperatures passed, finally, their long-term averages around about 1910 or 1920, on their way up to the unprecedented hot temperatures we have today. Corsets were abandoned for good at that very moment, just around the First World War. And sure, it probably has a lot to do with women's rights and freedoms and women entering the workforce, and maybe even a shortage of steel during the First World War, but it also happens to have happened just when the climate had finally bounced back from the Little Ice Age, when for the first time in 500 years, Europe and North America were back to historically average warmth. Starting at that moment, the whole paradigm of what clothing was transformed utterly. For half a millennium, the universally understood women's generic outfit was chemise and corset and petticoats and underdress and dress. Now all that was abandoned, replaced with a simple regimen of underwear and bra and 2 or 3 layers of clothing. Men pared down their basic outfit to underwear, shirt, trousers, and jacket. Even undershirts lost their cachet. Clothing got lighter in the teens and thin in the swingy 1920s. Swimsuits shrank further, becoming the skin-tight bodysuit that's still considered the base form today. In the late 1920s, there was a new fashion for uneven hemlines, and though it's rarely talked about, from experience, I know that these catch breezes like nobody's business. They would have been unthinkable in a cold climate, but became a form of play and movement in a warming one. Women's fashion became more form-fitting in the 1930s, but still lightweight compared to what it had been. Victorian revival fashions of the 30s looked nothing like the heavy, bulky originals. In the 1940s, wartime austerity made shorter dresses and simpler layers respectable. Even when the extravagance of the 1950s took hold, dresses only got stiff and sculpted rather than bulky and warm. European American women's fashions have been relatively cool, simple, and lightweight since at least the 1960s. We have reached the point where, as costume historian Patricia A. Cunningham said, women can just jump out of bed, throw on a bra, slip, pantyhose, pumps, and a comfortable knit dress before dashing out the door. And that was 25 years ago. I would argue most women's outfits are even simpler today. There have been recent historic-influenced fashion revivals, but each one has tended to be more lightweight and with fewer layers than the fashions they're inspired by. There are hobbyist history cosplayers, and their discussion groups tend to be loaded with tips on managing heat in clothes not designed for it. We're living in a different world with a different climate with different requirements. And here we are. Globally, the last 10 years have been the 10 hottest years in recorded human history. Whatever we wear in the future, it will need to address our needs in our environment, just as the clothing of the people of the past addressed theirs. It will be different from theirs because we are living in a new and very different climate. So yeah,